Hey there, and welcome into another episode of the Route 1 Rundown. If you eat, sleep, and breathe Maryland basketball, then this is the place for you. I'm your host, Steve Gorgie, and I'm thrilled to be back for another episode to talk some Terps. But before I dive into everything going on in College Park, just a reminder that this show is on YouTube. So if you're listening to it, but you want to be watching it, you got to go and check out youtube.com/@Department of Hoops. The Department of Hoops is a DMV media network, and it's a great place for all of your local hoops coverage. So if you love the Wizards, if you love the Terps, if you love the DMV hoop scene, you got to go check out the Department of Hoops. All right, so let's dive into this thing. And the talk all week long has been how Maryland is 0-4 on the road. They get a win against Nebraska to move to 4-0 at home and even up that conference record, that Big Ten record at 4-4, 500 on the season. But the talk all week long has been, why can't Maryland win on the road? And I'm going to dive into that. I'm going to give you my thoughts and opinions. We're going to talk about that at length. But first, let's get into that victory, because the Terps are coming off a win, a 69-66 home win over Nebraska, which did get Maryland back to even in Big Ten play. And as of this moment, Maryland now sits at number 24 in the net rankings, but they're 0-4 against quadrant 1 game in quad 1 games, 4-1 in quad 2 games, 2-0 in quad 3 games, 8-0 in quad 4 games. And there's a couple teams, Ohio State, UCLA, and Villanova in particular, who are just outside of that threshold needed for a quad 1 game. Ohio State is at number 34. UCLA is, I believe, at number 36. Let me just confirm that here. I'm sorry. UCLA is number 34. Ohio State is number 36. To qualify for a quad 1 victory, if you beat a team at home, they have to be in the top 30. They have to be 1-30. So they're just outside of that threshold. Now, Maryland beat Villanova on a neutral court. To earn a quad 1 victory on a neutral court, the team that you beat has to be in the top 50, numbers 1 through 50. Well, Villanova's at number 53. So there's a few teams there that are just outside that quad 1 threshold that could potentially move back into quad 1 at some point, but as of this moment, they are quad 2 games. That's why Maryland is 4-1 in quad 2, 0-4 in quad 1. And I say all that to say that Maryland feels right now at this moment in mid-January like they are very much a bubble team at this moment. Maryland is 500 in conference play, has a good net ranking, a good net rating, but that resume is leaving a bit to be desired, especially when you see that big 0, that goose egg in the quad 1 column, in the quad 1 wins column. That's concerning, and it feels like this is going to be a battle to the end for Maryland, especially given the relatively weak, not even relatively, just a weak non-conference strength of schedule there. It's a schedule that is not going to do any favors for the Terps come tournament time, and that's what makes it so much more important that they find a way to get some of those quad 1 wins, and that's probably going to come with finding a way to win on the road. So that's where the Terps stand right now, but they avoided disaster by getting a win against Nebraska, because 3-5 and a loss to that Nebraska team feels very different than 4-4, despite the fact that it feels like right now the state of the fan base is a little fragile. It's not a place where a lot of people are excited at the moment. Whatever excitement there was earlier in this season around Derek Queen and this team seems to have dissipated a little bit with some of these disappointing losses on the road, particularly the heartbreaker against Northwestern, the buzzer-beating loss in overtime. But they do bounce back, and they do get a win. And a couple of my takeaways from that game I'm going to run through right here. First and foremost, and this is a positive takeaway to be sure, and I'm going to have some more negative ones as well, because it wasn't a game that you necessarily walk away feeling great about. But from a positive perspective, to me, I'm seeing over the last few games, that Northwestern game and that Nebraska game, that Jacoby Gillespie is becoming a certified lead dog. He's the kind of lead guard that we've seen at Maryland time and time again over the past 10 or so years, whether it's Melo Trimble, whether it's Anthony Cowan, whether it was Jameer Young in the beginning of the Kevin Willard era. Maryland has frequently had these lead guards that can go and get you a bucket in big moments, that when the game is on the line, you can say, hey, I need a bucket and they can go get it. And that's what Jacoby Gillespie did in both the Northwestern game. He did it at the end of regulation and in overtime. And although the Terps lost that game, he delivered in those clutch situations. And then against Nebraska, after Maryland struggled down the stretch, they scored just 3 points in the final 5:05 of that game. Well, 2 of those points were the go-ahead basket, the go-ahead layup by Jacoby Gillespie in a tied ball game. After Maryland had given up a 9-point lead late in that game, they were able to turn to Jacoby Gillespie. They were able to get him matched up on a big man with a dribble handoff, and he was able to take Nebraska's big to the basket, and there was nothing that he could really do about it. Jacoby Gillespie delivers in the clutch. He did something very similar against Northwestern, even though Maryland lost that game. He got 2 big baskets, one in regulation and one in overtime. And when you combine that with the fact that he goes off for 22 points on 5 of 9 from 3 in that game against Nebraska, the game before that was not quite as efficient, certainly, but he delivered in the big-time moments. He did score 14 in that game. And then a couple games before that against UCLA, he goes off for 27, 4 of 8 from 3. You're talking about a guy who's shooting 43% from beyond the arc. You're talking about a guy who's now hitting clutch shots at the end of the first half. He looked like Melo Trimble. It was very Melo Trimble-esque at the end of the first half, hitting that 3 at the buzzer to send the Terps into the locker room on a high note there. And he is becoming a guy on a team where there are so many pieces and so many guys who can score, and I view that as a good thing, that Maryland has so many options. It seems like it's clear he's becoming the guy who is the lead. He's becoming the guy who they are going to turn to in big moments, and he's really delivered. And what makes it all that much more impressive to me is that he had a really bad road trip. That Washington game was the worst game that we've seen him play in a Maryland uniform. Just 1 point in that game, he fouls out. The whole offense looked discombobulated. It wasn't crisp, wasn't in rhythm, and I think a big part of that was because of Jacoby Gillespie in that game and the way he wasn't able to get going in that game. Well, he's done nothing but shine since then. Against Oregon, I thought he had a much better game, but he made some mistakes down the stretch. Okay, comes home, delivers with a 27-point performance against UCLA. I talked about what he did against Northwestern, and then we saw what he did against Nebraska. So that's my biggest takeaway from this game against Nebraska, is what Jacoby Gillespie is turning into. He's the kind of guy you can lean on. He's the kind of guy who you turn to in a big moment, when you need a basket, when the offense is bogged down, when you're playing this half-court Big Ten style of basketball that can be so challenging at times. He is the guy that the Terps are now looking to say, hey, we need a basket. We need to win this game. Can you deliver for us? And the answer over the past 2 games has really been a resounding yes. Now, look, before I've heaped a lot of praise on Gillespie here. He had a critical mistake against Northwestern. He really, in a lackadaisical way, took a 10-second backcourt violation at a critical juncture in overtime. I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's been perfect. He had some mental mistakes at the end of the Oregon game as well. But I am seeing a guy who you can turn to, who wants to take big shots, who can hit big shots. That's what I've seen the last couple of games from Jacoby Gillespie, and I think that's a really good thing for this Maryland team. Now, another takeaway here was particularly in this game, Jordan Geronimo, the reserve off the bench, really brought the energy. And this is a guy who hasn't gotten a lot of minutes lately, but he brought it against Nebraska. He played 11 minutes. He had played 5 minutes in the previous 3 games combined, 6 minutes in the previous 4 games combined. And he's a guy who didn't play in late November, early December because of an injury, but he's a guy who's experienced. He was a big part of last year's team. He had been around the Big Ten as a member of the Hoosiers a couple years before that, and he is a guy like Tafara Gapari who can be a spark plug, who can give you a lot of energy off the bench. Jordan Geronimo really did that yesterday, and he made some big plays that kept Maryland in the game, that kept Maryland kind of moving. He's just a high motor guy like Tafari Gapari, and those two guys the past couple of games, really focusing on Geronimo in the Nebraska game, have given Maryland something that they've been missing at times, and those are guys. It's nice to have not one but two of those guys, because I think what may not show up in the stat sheet is the way they are able to swing momentum in a game, whether it's a rebound, whether it's just their athleticism and length on defense, whether it's a block shot, whether it's just having a high motor and that rubbing off on everybody around you. Those two guys bring that, and particularly impressed with what Geronimo was able to do after playing very, very little over the previous, 3 weeks or so in that Nebraska game. So I took that as a big positive. My third and final positive from the game was Julian Reese was a defensive stalwart. After Jacoby Gillespie gets the big bucket to take the lead back, well, Reese makes a big play on the perimeter, getting a steal, not allowing Nebraska to get a shot off with a chance to tie or take the lead. Really impressed with Julian Reese and what he's been able to do on the defensive end, particularly in that game. The even a play before that, before Gillespie hit that big shot, Maryland gave up an offensive rebound off a free throw. Well, Reese blocked a shot on that possession right after that. Unfortunately, it was a loose ball from there. It was a scramble situation. Nebraska gets a foul, but Julian Reese came up with a big block there. Julian Reese, I think, is very clearly Maryland's best interior defender, and he's a guy who has been up to the challenge. In that UCLA game, there was a little bit of a back and forth with him and Bilodeau from UCLA, who was having a good game, but Reese buckled down and got some big stops in that game, and he's a guy I just feel like you can really trust. He is a defensive stalwart, and that's my third and final positive from that game. And there's a few negatives from this game because it was a 69-66 home win. It was close. It was a game where Maryland didn't always look great, and a big part of that is that it feels like Derek Queen is hitting a bit of a wall. A bit of a freshman wall here. And you hate to be too critical of the guy. You hate to be too hard on him because he has had such an unbelievable season for a freshman. I mean, the things he's done, going to Mackey, dropping 26 on Purdue. He's had big games in Big Ten play against Minnesota. He puts up 27. You see what he is capable of, and I think that's why at times you just even want more because you've seen what he can do in those kind of games. You see his skill set. You see how good he is. But against both Nebraska and Northwestern, it seemed like I'm using the word motor a lot today, but it seems like his motor was just not high enough in the game. Well, the play that I think is going to stand out to everybody when you think about the Nebraska game is the fact that he was not able to secure a defensive rebound off a missed free throw very late in that ball game, and it could have been very costly. Nebraska ends up tying the game because of that, and it could have been very costly for Maryland. And the question is it fatigue? Is it just getting used to the night in and night out grind of this league? There's a lot of things that it could be. And I'm a believer that Derek Queen is one of the most talented players I've ever seen put on a Maryland uniform. I mean, we've seen it. All the things that he can do. What makes him so special is that he is so versatile, is that he has this back to the basket game. He has this face-up game. He's a good passer. He can hit a jumper. He's creative. He has great court vision. He does so many things so well. But at this moment, it looks like he is tired. It looks like he is making mistakes. It looked like at times in that Nebraska game, he was getting a little bit bullied, and he scored 3 points in that game, only scored 9 against Northwestern. It's not as much about the point output for me. It's some of the things that we're seeing, like how he's going for rebounds. Jeff Furman, who is the publisher of Inside MD Sports, has been great calling this out, talking about how it looks like he's going for rebounds a lot with his arms rather than his legs, not putting a body on a guy. And I think a lot of that just comes with fatigue, to be quite honest. This is a tough league to play in, especially if you're a big man. And Kevin Willard said as much after the game. You know, what he had to say, and I'm going to quote directly here, he said, quote, "Everyone needs to take a deep breath and realize he's a freshman going against fifth-year seniors." He went on to say some things about how the league will make you struggle and how with the COVID year still in play, you have so many fifth-year guys, you have grown men in this league against a freshman. And I think that's all true. The question is, have we seen Derek Queen hit a wall for good this season? Or can he bounce back? Can he have those moments like we saw earlier this season, like we saw on the road at Purdue? Again, one of the toughest places to play. And that was against Trey Kaufman-Renn, one of the best bigs in the league. Can we see a game like he had against Minnesota where he just looked absolutely, or I'm sorry, against, what was it? Yeah, against Minnesota, where he looked absolutely sensational in that game, putting up 27 on 10 of 14 from the floor. We've seen these flashes. We've seen these moments. He was doing it very consistently in non-conference play, of course, against overmatched opponents. But what are we going to see from Derek Queen the rest of the season? I'm not going to judge him too much over these next 3 games because Maryland has 3 games over 10 days. They go on the road to Illinois, they stay on the road for a game against Indiana, and they come home for a game against Wisconsin. But then after that, they have a full bye week. They have a full week off. So I am going to judge Derek Queen by what he does in February because I am a huge believer in the talent of this guy. I've seen it with my own eyes. If you're watching Terps, so have you. You've seen his talent level. You see what he can do. And you've seen that he has a high motor. That it's not like he's a guy who we've seen throughout the year where you're just like, I don't know what he's doing out there. Doesn't look like he's giving full effort. I have my opinion. You may have yours. To me, I tend to believe this is a factor of fatigue. This is about playing a higher level of competition than Derek Queen has ever played in his life, a more physical level of competition, and a more challenging schedule than he's ever played in his life between the travel, and I know nobody wants to hear complaints about travel, but between the travel and just night in, night out grind of playing, I think it's something that can really wear on somebody going through it for the first time, no matter how talented he is. And I think that's what's happening to Derek Queen right now. I don't think this is a matter of a lack of effort. I think it is simply a matter of fatigue. So I'm going to be really interested. Maryland's got to find a way to make it through these 3 games. But then they get that bye week. And I'm going to be really interested to see. And that'll be that. So they played 8 games so far this season. They got 3 more till that bye week. So I will be interested to see if Derek Queen can find his motor again for the last 9 games of the season. And you know what? That's what stars are able to do. That's what really great players can do, is they can adjust in season. They can learn from some of these games, some of these experiences. And I think Derek Queen is a great player. So I'm going to be very interested to watch Derek Queen in the month of February coming off that 1 week bye week. The last thing here that I want to talk a little bit about in regards to the Nebraska game is it seems like the past few games, really, let's take a look at the schedule here because I want to make sure I'm hitting the moment right. I guess really since the start of the year, it seems like this Maryland team offensively is just having a hard time firing on all cylinders. Let's just run through it. Washington was not a good game. That was, to me, one of the worst offensive games I've seen from the Terps this season. And that was a really disappointing offensive performance to me. I think Queen had one of his worst games, and Gillespie had his absolute worst game. Now, Oregon, a little bit better performance on the offensive end for sure, but mistakes at the end of the game. UCLA, better offensive performance, but inconsistent. Minnesota, lackluster offensively. Northwestern, lackluster offensively. And Nebraska, I thought they were really carried, Maryland was, by the guards in that game. Gillespie, we've talked about already, had a great game. Rodney Rice had a really nice game for the Terps in that one, scoring 15. And Selton Miguel goes 3 of 8 from 3, and that's what you need from him. He puts up 13. So I thought the backcourt was good, but the front court wasn't as good. Reese and Queen combined for just 11 points in that game. And what I've seen from the Terps since conference play started back up at the beginning of January, beginning of 2025, is that it feels like every night somebody else is stepping up, which is great. It's a good thing. I love that. But they haven't found a way to get everybody going on the same night. And when you go on the road and you play a team like Illinois, who they have next, who is a very good team, who is sitting at right now in the Ken Palm rankings, Illinois is sitting at number 9. That's tops in the Big Ten. That's ahead of Purdue, despite the fact that they just lost a game to Michigan State. Michigan State 7-0 in the conference, sitting atop the conference standings there. Illinois is maybe the most talented team in this conference. If they want to win at Illinois, they have to find a way to get everybody going at the same time. It can't be Gillespie's on, but Miguel's not hitting shots from the outside. It can't be Queen has a great game, but Reese doesn't. They need everybody going at the same time, and that's something that I just haven't seen since conference play kicked off again at the start of January. So can Maryland get everybody hitting on all cylinders offensively at the same time? It remains to be seen, but it's going to be a big key for them if they want to put this thing together and really finish the season strong and get a seed in this NCAA tournament that they can advance with. Not an 8 seed and not a 9 seed. They can't be on that 8-9 line because you set yourself up with a 1 seed in the second round, and it's a really tough place to be. So I think that's going to be a big key for Maryland the rest of the way if they want to accomplish what I've been saying I think they can. I have been saying repeatedly, I feel like this is the Maryland team most well-equipped to advance in the NCAA tournament, to hit the second weekend since that 2010 team that was led by Gravis Vasquez. And I know that team didn't do it. I know that the last Maryland team that did make the Sweet 16 was that 2016 team. I always think of it as the Diamond Stone team because that was his 1 year here at Maryland. But in reality, it was the Mello Trimble team. It was Rashid Suleiman was a huge part of that team. Jake Lehman. I always just think of it in my mind as the Diamond Stone team because it was the 1 year where Diamond Stone was here, and he was a big part of that team. So I felt like, and I've been feeling like this team is even more well-equipped than that team, to be perfectly honest, to advance because I just felt like there's not an obvious hole on this team. And that is what makes the fact that they are 0-4 on the road in conference play this season all the more frustrating because it doesn't feel like there is an obvious hole on this team. You don't look at this roster and say, well, it's just not deep enough. Or they don't have shooters. They're just a bad three-point shooting team like you could sit there and say last year. This Maryland team feels like it has the pieces to compete for a Big Ten title, which I think at this point is kind of out of the question, but make the tournament and advance in the tournament. So why can't Maryland win on the road? That's the question that everybody has really been asking since that Northwestern loss. That is the big question among the Maryland fan base this week. The Terps 4-0 in the conference at home, 0-4 on the road, and now Kevin Willard, over the course of his time at Maryland, is 4-20 in Big Ten road games. So I was trying to look for an answer this week because just like everybody else, I want to understand. I want to figure it out. Why can't Maryland win on the road? Well, I went back. I looked at a bunch of numbers. I watched a bunch of stuff. And there's not any one thing that truly stands out. It's a little bit of everything. You know, against Purdue and Oregon, I felt like it was not executing down the stretch. There were some lapses. There were some potentially mental mistakes. It was just not doing the little things down the stretch that win you basketball games. Now, you could kind of say the same thing against Northwestern, but I thought against Northwestern, they certainly did some things down the stretch that just didn't make sense, that it will cost you a ball game. But I also thought the offense was stalling in that game. Certainly, I didn't think they took care of the ball well enough in that basketball game. And then against Washington, I felt like it was the same thing with the offense stalling, not looking crisp. I've talked about the Jacoby Gillespie 1 point. I've talked about how I think that was Derek Queen's worst offensive game of the season. That, to me, was kind of an offensive issue. So it's hard to look at this and say, hey, last year, it was obvious. Maryland was not a good three-point shooting team. Maryland really struggled from beyond the arc. They were one of the worst three-point shooting teams in the country, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. Let me get them real quick here just to make sure. But I believe they were a lot worse shooting the ball on the road than they were at home. So on the road last year from beyond the arc, Maryland was 29.7% in conference play. In home games, I was wrong. Okay, 26.5% at in home conference games, 29.7 in road conference games. Either way, not very good. But still, that was a thing where you could just look at that team and say, this is not a good three-point shooting team, and it's going to hurt them on the road. That's something that you just can't overcome. This isn't a team where you look at it and you say, like, okay, this is what they don't do well, and it's going to cost them, and it's particularly going to hurt them on the road. So I think that is what's particularly frustrating about the fact that they're 0-4, is that you can't pinpoint one thing and say, oh, this one particular guy doesn't play well on the road, or they're not doing this on the road. It's a little bit of everything. And I think part of that is what comes with a team that hasn't played a lot of basketball together, but also you want to see a team improve and get those things right and learn from the experience as the season goes on. I don't think we're at the point in college basketball anymore where we're going to see a ton of dominant teams. You know, even look at UConn a couple of years ago when they won the national championship. They had 8 losses. Last year, UConn was a much more dominant team. Purdue was a much more dominant team, but Purdue still had 5 losses on the season. I don't think we're going to see a lot of like 32-1 type teams going into the NCAA tournament, 30-2 type teams anymore. So, you know, I think that the margins are pretty thin. I think the margins are pretty thin in this sport. I think we're going to start to see a lot of like, and we've seen it in the past, a lot of 6-loss, 5-loss 1 seeds in the NCAA tournament. I mean, I'm just looking back here at some recent years. You know, the year Kansas won the national championship, they went 34-6. They entered the NCAA tournament with 6 regular season losses, and they got a 1 seed that season. So I don't necessarily think it is like college basketball of old or college football of old, where it's like you gotta be perfect, and we're gonna know early on just how good you are, but you have to really be perfect or close to perfect throughout the year. Not that you ever had to be perfect in college basketball, but it felt like, you know, back in the early 2000s, the late 90s, there were a lot more teams that went into an NCAA tournament with something like a, 28-3 record. I mean, let's just look at Maryland the year they won the national title. They entered the NCAA tournament with a 26-4 record. They were 15-1 in conference. Duke that season as well, one of the top seeds in the NCAA tournament, was 29-3 entering the tournament. So I say all that to say, I think you can't write teams off early. But what you do want to see is you want to see teams learn from their mistakes, even if they're losing close games. And I think that's what we're going to have to see with Maryland. Can they learn from some of these mistakes? Can they get some of that stuff right? Can they fix the defensive communication down the stretch that I thought was a little bit of an issue against Purdue and Oregon? Can they take care of the ball better than they did against Northwestern? Can the offense look crisper? Can they get everybody going at the same time like they were unable to do against Washington and Northwestern? That's what I want to look for the rest of the season. So I don't have a great answer to why can't they win on the road. There's one thing that I did notice, and one thing that feels like it's a consistent thing across all 4 of those conference road losses, and it's that they haven't played defense as well on the road. So in those 4 conference home games, they haven't allowed an opponent to go over 1 point per possession. Well, on the road, they haven't been able to hold an opponent under 1 point per possession. And the thing that stood out to me in those games that I've talked about a lot this year is they were much better. Maryland was much better at forcing turnovers at home. At home, in those 4 conference games, they're forcing a turnover percentage of 23.7. On the road, it's just 15.6. And it kind of goes back to what I said a couple weeks ago, where I feel like this Maryland team is very dependent on forcing turnovers to get stops. I feel like when this team gets into a half-court game, they struggle to get stops. But when they're playing more of an up and down game, when they're getting in your face, when they're putting pressure on you, they are able to force turnovers and get stops in that way. And then, of course, that helps the offense because it's leading to run outs. It's live ball turnovers that can lead to easy baskets. So that is the one thing. If there was one thing you were going to hit on and say, this is it, I think it's the difference in the defense, and the difference in the defense is driven by that ability to force turnovers, which seems to be happening at a much higher rate. Not seems to be, it is happening at a much higher rate at home than it is on the road. And it'll be interesting to see the rest of the way. Does Kevin Willard say, hey, we are a team that for whatever reason is maybe deficient in our half-court defense. We need to create turnovers to get stops. Is that something that he thinks, or is that something that I'm just seeing looking at numbers here? Is that not something that he feels about his team? And if it is something he feels about his team, he's got two choices. Either you really commit to say, we are going to do everything we can to force turnovers on every possession, even if it leads to some easier buckets, because we know we just can't lock down for 30 seconds. We got to get a stop some way, and we feel like our best opportunity is by creating a turnover. Or are there some subtle changes? Is there something with strategy, with lineups, with scheme that they can change to get better at really locking down in the half court, playing defense for 30 seconds, and getting a stop when they need it? So that was the one thing that I did see. But all in all, it feels like it's been something a little bit different in every one of these road games. And I think in some ways that makes it a little more encouraging, because you're like, there's not a fatal flaw with this team. There's not something that they just don't do well that they can't fix. But at the same time, when it is something different every game, that can be extraordinarily frustrating too, because it feels like, okay, great. Against Washington, against Washington, if you're a Maryland fan, you say against Washington, they weren't good offensively. Okay, well, coming back against Oregon, pretty good offensively, but struggled defensively, struggled down the stretch, struggled with some communication, struggled with some execution. Well, we got that fixed, but now something new popped up. So I understand why that's extraordinarily frustrating. The bottom line here for Maryland is where they sit right now. Good computer numbers, net of 24. But the strength of schedule, that resume, means there's a lot to be desired. That means they need to go get some good wins. And not winning on the road puts so much pressure on you to win every game that you play at home. If Maryland wants to make the tournament, if Maryland wants to get a good seed in the tournament, they are going to have to find a way to go out and get some road wins. Because Willard's first year, they did go 10-0 at home. They went 1-9 on the road for an 11-9 record. You just limit your opportunities so much when you can't go win on the road. And ultimately, this is a sport that's all about March. Now, Maryland's won a couple neutral site games, one against Syracuse, one against Villanova. And the NCAA tournament isn't played on the road. It's played at neutral sites, but it's played away from home. And you got to go find a way to win away from home, whether that's a neutral site or on the road. Maryland's been a lot better at neutral sites, not so good on the road. The bottom line, they got to find a way to be better away from Xfinity Center. And there are still plenty of time left in this season. They're 4-4. There's 12 conference games left. There's plenty of time to get this thing figured out and take it up a level, but that's what you're going to have to start to see. So for me, they got to find a way to get through these 3 games. They have Illinois. They have Indiana. They have Wisconsin at home. If they can find a way to be 2-1, to get to go 2-1 in those games, to get to 6-5 in the conference with 9 games to go and a week off. I think that's a good place to be. And then you really want to see them figure some things out, make some corrections, make some changes, and take it to a new level coming down the stretch for those last 9 games. We'll see if they can do it. That's the show for today. Thanks for hanging out and enjoy those couple of Terps road games, some big ones at Illinois and at Indiana before returning home for Wisconsin. So enjoy those games, and until next time, I'm your host, Steve Gorgie. This has been the Route 1 Rundown.